This is Human Coined, a series that unpacks the mechanics of public finance, the complexities of democracy, and the societies they ultimately shape. I'm your host, Jeff Dubrow. Join me in a social dialogue that cracks open important issues that are too often ignored here at home and around the world.
Diana Gichengo, the Executive Director of the Institute for Social Accountability in Kenya. Welcome to Human Coin.
Thank you very much, Geoff. Thank you for having me. And hello from Maputo, Mozambique.
Yes, I understand you're at the AfriDebt conference on related to the link between gender and debt, public debt.
Yes, we are in Maputo for the African AFCOD 4. This is the fourth conference since this particular series of annual debt conferences started. And this year, we're looking at feminist approaches to debt and development, something very new where then we are interrogating the lived realities, systemic and structural issues that affect the debt and public finance or fiscal architecture on our continent, in our countries, globally, and so on. So it's been an interesting space. Geoff, here, I started my career in the women's rights movement, working on property rights, and I started working on human rights. Then I came to economic and fiscal justice issues, and a part of me was just like, do these people understand what all this analysis that they produce daily mean for the lived realities of different groups, especially the most marginalized, women, for Kenya back home, indigenous communities, stateless communities? For them, they are just numbers. This is what it means. We are headed for a crash. We're in a debt crisis. It ends there. Some matrices, or this particular Lafeka, and so on, different theories at macro level, micro level. Then, so for me, you try to infuse it, but I also feel like I have been on an overreach to try and learn all the economic terminologies to stay ahead. So being in Maputo was quite refreshing. I engaged with people who are economic policy analysts and practitioners who are just like, what is this? What are we discussing? How on earth we are supposed to be discussing what to do in the next annual meetings of the World Bank and IMF, or the spring meeting? Why are we discussing early pregnancies? What have they got to do with it? So it was a very interesting space of just trying to create the linkages that, as long as one form of what one form of oppression will do to very many other forms of oppressions or exploitation, trying to weave all that in has been quite an arduous task. And I know, particularly for the organizers of this particular conference, AfroDebt, the Nawi Collective, and Feminist, it's been a tall order, because the conference did very well in mobilizing, I would say, half new feminists who work on feminism, not necessarily on economy, and the other half people who work on economic policy analysis and advocacy. So you could feel the tensions. But in the end, I think the last two closing panels did that very well. It's a challenge that will continue to carry. It's a challenge I carry to my country context in terms of the coalition that we run and how we are able to incorporate all these issues of marginalization. And it's a huge challenge. It's not exactly very easy, because on the African continent and most of the global south, I almost feel I am validated. I am working on oppressive global financial infrastructure. So I'm making my contribution to feminism. I am interrogating political power that is oppressive. But I think what I carry is we cannot lose the traditional lens that what is happening in the villages in Nairobi in Turkana, all that the effects we are feeling when we are not able to fuel our cars. There are people who are not able to raise the fare, the transport they require to travel once every quarter to go and say visit their children who've been adopted or supported. So if we lose that, we fail to humanize, and especially in countries and contexts where you have up to 40% of population living below poverty lines, and most of them are women and girls. So that has been Maputo. We're just getting ready to go and sing and dance to feminist songs and chants and issue a statement.
Okay.
Yeah.
This is fascinating. You mentioned you've got your start in your career start in women's rights. Would a conference like this on debt and development, on debt and gender in Africa have been possible 15 years ago, 20 years ago? Was there such a dialogue taking place, such a discourse?
No, I don't think this was a possibility. And if you think about it, even the Maputo Protocol, the Women's Rights Charter Protocol to the African Charter, is nearly 30 years old. And the Abuja Declaration that then apportions budget for particularly socioeconomic rights was not something that the gender community and the budget community ever brought together. This was unimaginable. I have raised children marriages, but we were discussing ownership of property. Women were property themselves. This would not have been a possibility at all. It's unfathomable. We all women were doing is organizing around HIV, reproductive health, things like that, to get to the center of economic issues and bring gender aspect, feminist ideologies is simply, it's remarkable. It's extremely, extremely powerful. And I must also say, it's not like it's also uncomfortable. It's not entirely comfortable. I could feel in the room that we are pushing certain limits, certain boundaries in this conversation. But it is beautiful that it is now a conversation on the table. It was the theme of the conference. People were required, even with their struggles, to try and think about gender, debt, and development, and so on. So this is a huge milestone, and I think it will also strengthen the solidarity that is needed across different movements, because there's a debt and quote unquote inequalities movement that is around the exploitation, the extraction of our financial system at all levels. But without the needed linkages from the women's movement, feminist movement, minorities movement, we will not be able to shape this particular very strong hegemony that is in the economic that is the economic power. And Geoff, I've told you I started from women's rights to human rights, and I like to use this particular analogy that I used to think that engaging with ministries of security, interior, and so on, that coordinate is the most difficult thing. They are the most difficult ones to access, and then engage them for over 10 years.
Old school thinking, old school, yeah.
Yes. But I came to the economy and treasuries. Goodness, treasuries. They are very exclusive, extremely exclusive, very, very elite, unwelcoming. They wonder what do you have you read the numbers? What shit? There is no humanness in that particular phase. And even the ministries of the interior say in my country, they are very humble when going to treasury. You do not want your budget cut. Without budget,
Of course.
there's nothing you can do. So that I hope brings out the milestone that AFCOD 4 has made.
And so tell me, or tell us, the myself and our listeners, what was your key message? I was from the Ministry of Finance in a particular country. What was your key message about the importance of and how to include in the response to a debt crisis the most vulnerable people in society?
Our key message was one, and in Kenya we brought two messages. First was the message that for us to address this, we must become fully accountable to all, including the most vulnerable that we exploit, using, say, giving them handouts and bursaries because they're bearing the brunt of this. And in that regard, the Nairobi Citizens Assembly on Debt concluded that we need to focus on prosecuting and jailing all those who have stolen public money, either debt money or tax money, because it's brought us to where we are. But secondly, that the space must open up completely to allow the diverse perspectives to be that of how women, especially the most marginalized women, are experiencing the debt crisis, how they're easily drafted and drawn out austerity measures, particularly on health and education. They go directly to impact and push women deeper into poverty, into marginalization. In Kenya, for instance, I gave the example that part of the proposed budget cuts were around the school feeding program, where then the government decided we do not need to put in money for feeding children in school. But what does that mean when you apply a feminist lens? It means people who daily would take their children to school, first because they'll have the only probably meal of the day or the alternative meal of the day, while their mothers and sometimes fathers are out there feeding for the next meal. It will just become a headache in that particular family. So you take away from them any opportunity they had to access education, and secondly, you take away the opportunity for them to go and look for food, because there is diminished income, but there is also diminished opportunity in children just having a basic meal. Our health model as well, and how it's proposing different matrices for how people and households will be able to access healthcare. Again, looks very, very good on paper, or will be able to raise revenue. It is not about revenue. It is about ensuring that people experience a sense of dignity, and we continue to invest in those who are furthest behind. But to do that, it means we'll have to have more voices of marginalized people, of citizens on the table at all levels, and it's the place of movement building that has to be elevated. So those were the two key messages that I brought to Maputo.
And this is a very good segue into our topic on the debt crisis and the recent events in Kenya. Before we get there, I just have one question from a gender budgeting perspective that I'm sure you asked, and I'd like to know if you ever got an answer from the Kenyan government. How on earth could anybody decide to cut something as essential as children's meals programs in response to a debt crisis? Did you ever get a response? Did you ask that question? I'm sure you did. And did you ever get a response from the Kenyan government on that?
The closest we came was, it is one of the newer lines in the budget. We didn't traditionally have school feeding programs, so it's a new thing. So what you do, you retain the traditional lines first, and then these are newer ones. But other than that, the rest just went quiet, and some of them were shocked that was happening. And to be honest, in the supplementary appropriation, we saw a number of people speak to the issue. But you can imagine more from Treasury. What would be their response to the fact that they were audacious enough to imagine remove school feeding program, And it doesn't end there. It is that we have a new school model that where we will set up something called junior secondary school. There's not a single teacher. All of them are intern. Then you say, as part of austerity, is we will have no permanent children, no permanent teacher for junior secondary school moving forward as part of austerity. Okay, so what happens to millions of children? I think the total number is like 2 million who will get into that particular system of education. So I think what we, I don't know, austerity is a bad thing, Geoff. Anywhere, as you do all the gender budgeting, anywhere IMF, World Bank, governments mention austerity, fiscal consolidation, those are bad words. For people at all levels, and especially the most marginalized, because it means exactly that. The second thing that was done away was free sanitary towels in schools, and then the ones that are in the market were taxed. Okay, but because for them it's something so negligible that $1, a packet costs $1. For the people who make these policies, it's such a non-issue. It feels like toilet paper. But for girls who get these particular sanitary towels free, it is the difference between them staying in school and not. It is the difference between staying there and not going to get married, because first the shame and humiliation will go away for 9 months when you're pregnant, and then you'll be in a family where it will be easy and you can excuse yourself when you have your monthly period. It's just horrific when you do not apply a gender lens, when you do not apply feminist lenses. The outcomes are catastrophic. They are nonsensical to us reasonable people, but most people in power are clearly unreasonable.
And before we get to the crisis situation in Kenya, or the debt crisis in Kenya, I just want to make one comment that is interesting. Ignorance is no excuse. But what I find interesting, particularly in countries that are undertaking a line item system of budgeting, and I know Kenya is a little bit more advanced than that, but part of the problem is that when people look at a budget that's developed on a line item basis, what they're seeing are employee salaries, capital expenditures, recurrent expenditures. They're not, employee travel, training. They're not actually seeing real programs that affect real people. And so there's no excuse for that, for the thinking, but when you said that we have to take care of the basic line items first, it almost occurred to me that in a way, that's a huge part of the problem. I've had this conversation with another podcast guest recently. But the way a budget is presented matters for the way that policymakers think, and it's very easy to to focus on those recurrent expenditures,
Sure.
and not think about real people and how they're going to be impacted by budgets and budget cuts.
That's very true. And what also happens is, therefore, whoever comes to defend the budget from different government departments and agencies, they defend those recurrent expenditure. They defend those particular lines as opposed to the entire development and the impact on people, on humans, and so on. When they are pushed, they immediately go to the lines, and the lines that do not self-preservation. They preserve themselves, their salary, their allowances, their comfort, and then spread the discomfort to everybody else. And that tends to be the majority of the people. In Kenya, we are now proposing that by 2026, we'll do zero-based budgeting. Budget. But again, like you said, it cannot be line by line. It has to have a development outlook, it has to have a whole people level outcome, what the change we want to see in people is, and then we budget based on that. But as it is currently, we'll keep facing those particular hurdles where we've removed everything around clean water and just retained salaries of people who will advise whether the water has the proper chemical composition.
Let's move to the situation in Kenya. Why don't you maybe start with tell us the sort of the story about how Kenya got into the debt crisis, what Akua Chumi, under your leadership, the leadership of TISA, has been doing coordination has been doing around the debt crisis. And then we could talk maybe about the government's heavy-handed response and where recent events are.
Okay. Thanks. The Kenya debt crisis draws or can be traced to especially the last 12 years, where then there was previously and particularly the Kibaki-led government between 2002. What happened was efforts to reduce the deficit, create a lot of trust, deal with corruption, and raise revenue significantly. I think during that period, there was a year where we heard a budget that had a zero deficit. We didn't need to borrow. After 2007, and we had a government of a grand coalition government, then the need for more development, going to different places, built a certain ambition. And because back then we were a stable economy with good resources, we were very attractive in terms of people who would give us credit. We then went on to accumulate credit and did not utilize it for development without interrogating the terms and so on. And the good thing about sovereign debt is when you acquire it, unlike where you're building your mortgage directly, the debt that President Kibaki acquired, he's not the one who paid. So it became very easy for all governments consecutively to just keep accumulating. President Uhuru Kenyatta as government was particularly the worst. So we went for all form of credit. We took bilateral loans. We took commercial loans. We were in the form of Eurobonds and so on. We went for multilateral funding. Any loan. Actually, nowadays I have learned that our fundraising department was always very well funded to just keep contracting more loans. But Kenya has a history of stealing debt. We do have the Golden Bag scandal, the Anglo leasing scandal. All those are debt scandals, debt money being stolen. So what would happen is people would go and negotiate terms that were very poor for the country, but they would get direct benefit. We had something like the Eurobond that was acquired in 2014, never hit Kenya's consolidated fund for some time. The Auditor General raised question. Later, we were told a portion of it came. But then we even got careless to the point where in Kenya, the law requires that debt ought to be procured directly for a development project.
Yes.
So we would do general infrastructure, and immediately it got into the budget, it will become budget support. Then crunch time came, starting from 2017, 2018, when the loans started becoming due, including the initial payment for the standard gauge railway. And all of a sudden, because all the debt money most of it had been misappropriated, poorly negotiated, we never saw the benefit. There was no money to repay it. And what you must realize, Jeff, is in the last 20 years, our revenue has grown 10 times. That's like 1,000%. Our revenue collection. From 250 billion Kenya shillings, last year we were closing with almost 3.4 trillion Kenya shillings. So it's grown abundantly. Our population has not even grown at that particular scale. So we ought to be okay. But because of the carelessness, last week when we had the Citizens Assembly, a number of speakers came and just said the bad manners of our political class are the reason why we are where we are. So we are now faced with very many instances where we are about a debt repayment is due, and what we do is there is no money from the Kenya Revenue Authority. We immediately float a bond, and they became so attractive that even domestically, all our banks and even insurance companies, they do not even work hard. All they do is buy government treasury bills and treasury bonds, because at any given point, the rate is so high. It's between 17. It could go all the way to 25%. And this is guaranteed. There's nothing else. Just give government, they do whatever they want, we will get back our money. So that then affected the economy. Government always had cash to use and misuse as they deemed fit. Then we got to the point where now all credit was becoming very, very expensive. The IMF got wind of what we were doing, and now it was not as easy to float the Eurobonds, and we got into the IMF fiscal consolidation program in 2019. We were supposed to work on it very, very fast. 2021, 2022, we should have been out, but it has taken us up to 2023, and right now we are begging to be part of the IMF fiscal consolidation because we have nowhere else to go. Early this year, when the Eurobond payment, this very painful Eurobond payment that never came to Kenya was due, at this point we were saying, can you just go and tell whoever took the money to repay it? But government floated a Eurobond, the highest in our region. The rate is close to 10% for a Eurobond. And if the 2014 one is anything to go by, we took that one at the rate of about 5% interest rate. By the time it was due, it was at 10. So this one, by the time we are repaying in a span of 10 to 30 years, the interest will be at what? 17, 20 for a loan to the people. Sovereign debt at that interest rate is simply ridiculous. So our own poor negotiation is getting us to where we are, and then a craving by the people who control economic power, the IMF, the World Bank, the big governments. They just come and give us the worst of rate because they know our appetite for loans is very, very high. So we get the worst of terms. And I know in Kenya we have everything. We have asset-based loans. We are now working on resource-based, like even our current medium-term debt strategy. You know how government floats options? We have floated all the options for raising revenue because we are looking for it in every direction without addressing our biggest problem currently, which is an expenditure problem.
Which is an expenditure problem. So if we stick with the revenue for a moment, and I guess this does concern the expenditures as well in terms of the fiscal consolidation, why don't we talk a little bit about what got Kenya into the recent round of protests, specifically focused on the finance bill that was introduced by the government?
Okay. So just like I've told you, Kenya does not have a revenue problem. We do have an expenditure problem. And we have a significantly well-educated youth population. If you're to work with Gen Z and millennials, you have a significant, I think we are reported to have the highest educated youth population in Africa, based on our population. And this didn't start this year. I would more relate it particularly to the election year 2022, where there were proposals to increase tax, and this is when the value-added tax on petroleum was introduced with a lot of resistance. We galvanized the population, the citizen, to speak to it very, very strongly, linked it to the debt question. And what happened during the campaign period is that leading presidential candidates, all of them got to the point of top of their priority was how they would deal with the high public debt, high taxes, and just wastage. So everybody, and particularly President Ruto, then took a very strong, like almost presented, it looked like a philosophy of economic emancipation where there is no wastage, there is no economic extraction and exploitation. So that is in 2022. Fuel subsidies are proposed to be done away with, maize and subsidies and so on. But one government brings it in when they realize the cost of living is too high. In 2023, which was the first budget to be introduced by the President Ruto after he was elected, we expected that then he would immediately start off his legacy of economic emancipation in that particular budget. And he was cautioned publicly, look, if the minute you sign off this particular budget before you do a debt audit and therefore decide if we have odious debt or not, you will have gotten yourself into the same mix. He hesitated, but eventually he brought his first budget and his first revenue-raising measures in the Finance Bill of 2023. The Finance Bill of 2023 was equally controversial. Before 2024, this was a one-time where Parliament had over 1,200 entries from members of the public. As a Uchumi, we made our submission. We told people, engage your members of Parliament. There is no way they are going to pass this. This is the effect it will have, because this is when we reduced, we lowered we went lower in terms of the minimum taxable income. We increased the income bands for pay as you earn, which is progressive. But for a country where there's a lot of black tax, it was also contentious. The value-added tax on petroleum products was standardized. We introduced a very aggressive model of collection of tax, particularly to the informal sector, introduced turnover tax on the informal sector. We were taxing all forms of imports, including raw materials that we currently do not produce. And there was a very, very strong pushback. That particular, for me, the analysis and what went, the mockery thereafter, when Parliament passed, they had the majority numbers, so they passed, and then all we were left to do, the housing levy was also introduced at this point, and the housing levy was introduced as a tax. By the time it was passed, it was a levy. So a very confused legislative proposal. It was dropped later, again passed as a single legislation. We went to court and continued to litigate on this. But Kenyans were extremely angered by the bullish manner that their representative responded to them. They said, look, we have a government, we have debts to repay, we have an economy to run, we have a manifesto to run. You will either pay up or deal with the consequences. And that in the midst of all this, all we were seeing was all government officials had crazy travels in the country and outside. All those who had recently gotten into power were accumulating wealth and rubbing it in our faces in a very ridiculous way. So based on this time we engaged with the budget, the medium-term revenue strategy. People already had ideas. There were some taxes that they didn't even introduce around farmers and livestock. It was to be brought after the finance bill. But all this was in the public domain where people are in shock. Oh my goodness, they still need more money. And it was clearly interpreted they need more money from us, not to repay the debt, but to furnish their own lifestyles through stealing from us the tax money without necessarily reducing the debt burden. So the next time this happened, we went before Parliament. Parliament was more restrictive this time, and the number of people who were able to make submissions were not as many. The media presence when you were making
about the 2024 finance bill, is that where we're at right now?
Now I am in the 2024. Yes, the 2024 compared to 2023, the media coverage of everything was much lower, at least for when Okoa Uchumi was making its submissions and so on. You could tell the MPs were quite uncomfortable with us. But this time when they went, and based on our experience previously, even before the protest, I think we called on Kenyans, write to your MP. At this rate, that's your boss. Let them not excuse themselves using the presidency or a political party. Engage them. If you do not engage, you can already feel, you already know what the increased taxation in 2023 did. This is supposed to be double because the revenue targets were to be double. And then in 2024, even the manufacturing industry, the microfinance industry came out very boldly, and the communication sector to say this is what the cost will look like once this is enacted. So people had a picture of how their lives would drastically change. But the Finance Bill 2024 also targeted the digital and creative industry, where majority of Kenyan youth who are jobless, that's the only place they run to be able to even survive a day, get their fare, and do things like that. Based on that, and when they got the initial analysis, they dug deeper, they created more scenarios around what the lived experience. So the anger was just increasing. Then a few civil society leaders would be like, let's go to the street. To be honest, I have called for people to go to the streets many years. 2023, we called on people. I expected people would go on to the streets. They did. So this time we were a bit skeptical, and people would ask us, what will you do? After this, we will go to the streets. If the streets don't work, we will go to court. And voila, the first day happens, and there are thousands of people in the city. By the time it was the second Thursday, and the committee had already presented their report, they had dropped the controversial, quote unquote, controversial
budget appropriation. We need Diana just to clarify. Sorry for the interruption. Is that budget appropriations you're speaking about?
No, this is the Finance and Planning Committee. The Budget and Appropriation Committee.
Yes, you're right.
Yes, the Budget and Appropriation Committee. This is where they were doing all the money for. They were proposing reduced funding to, say, the higher education loans board, things like that. But the budget side, immediately the pushback. There were a few changes, but it became the reason why they're saying, for us to meet all your demands, you must raise revenue. So the engagement around the finance bill was with the Finance and Planning Committee. So they came back, and like for me, they updated me and they're like, Diana, people need now to go quiet. We have really listened. This time we have really listened. And I know that when the chair of the Finance Committee finalized, he was like, this is the day you people are starting your protest. Yes. Like, speak to us before you go to State House. Then he was like, I have been summoned to be there very early. So we let them be. But immediately thereafter, they presented all their proposals and said they had dropped them. To be honest, the members of parliament and government still thought that the same level of pushing over the citizens' demand would work. And even for us, there was a sigh of relief. Some of the controversial issues and controversial taxes had been dropped. But what we learned is the message that had been going out, we do not have a revenue problem, was an expenditure problem. Kenyans were not willing to raise any more additional revenue until accountability mechanism had been passed. And that is why there was a call for reject the finance bill in its entirety, in its totality. Like, we are no longer negotiating that it is okay to attack this sector and drop this sector. No, in the long run, it comes to all of us. And if you're to ever increase taxes, we must be sure that whatever you have, you're using it properly. I doubt that message has gotten to government properly. They are yet to understand that, because they are now proposing to get into more revenue raising measures. Kenyans are clear. You people are thieves. You keep stealing from us. That is why we have an unsustainable debt. You'll keep borrowing. You send the worst negotiators, because there were even analysis of what a good debt contract ought to look like for Kenya. And these were very young lawyers. So they were raising questions. Who are these lawyers? Say, whether it is in the Attorney General's office, wherever they are, or Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Surely we are brilliant enough to negotiate proper contract for ourselves. We cannot be negotiating these bad contracts that then continue to weigh down on us. Then there was a lot of hostility towards IMF. Again, why? Because in particular, the Okauchumi letters were out there, where we speak, you people don't listen to us. It's just between Treasury and yourself. And there was also this perception that the American government was really in the face of Kenya's public affairs. And that was equated that how they then rein in and take over governance matters is through the IMF-led processes and the World Bank. So even the revenue-raising measures, the budget was considered an IMF budget. So another, there were even discussions of, we've lost our sovereignty, our president is a puppet, he speaks for somebody, a different masters. So all that anger, it became, first, no more additional expenditure. Secondly, you will listen to us. We are the ones who are capable of defending our sovereignty. You've lost that particular legitimacy. And the demonstration then went on, started with reject the finance bill, then more analysis. This is a deep-rooted governance and systemic issue in the political class, and that is how the tag Ruto must go came to play. A tag that represents the entire political architecture. And in that, it meant the current establishment within the executive needs to live, and within parliament, because just for Kenya, how the speakers of both the Senate and the National Assembly were appointed, they were like position given by the president. Then you have the leaders of majority and minority. Some of the rulings that are made do not represent what an august house ought to look like. So by so doing, it meant we need to change the leadership of parliament and of the executive to a leadership that really cares about the interest of the people. Yeah, so that's how finally we got to the point where the president called members of parliament to tell them, thank you very much for passing my bill, but now I'm going to reject it and return it to you so that I remain in power.
And I think that the part that shocked me the most was on June 24th, or June 25th, I guess it was. There were protests, turmoil, bloodshed. BBC reported that the president said that, quote, legitimate, unquote, protests against his policies had been, again, quote, hijacked by a group of organized criminals, and that the government would use all means at its disposal to prevent a repeat of the violence at whatever cost. That made me sick to my stomach to hear that. Given the respect that I have for Kenya, tell me what it was like to hear those words from the president, and how the reaction went after that.
June 25th was horrible. First, I was on the streets. I was on the streets on June 25th. I don't even think I managed to get to Parliament. I turned midway to go and help people get medical help because of how many people who had been shot and were just being rescued on motorcycles on the street. And it just happened so fast. People were peaceful. All of them headed to Parliament just to wait for this particular vote and push. We were supposed to sit there the entire evening. And having been on the street and fully aware it was largely the youth, the working class of Kenya that was on the streets, not criminals. So it was us that he was calling criminals.
Yeah.
For desiring accountability, he called us criminals. At first, I was so scared because of all the shootings and the killings and the blood I had seen that day. And then I went and spoke to a few younger people than me, Gen Zs, who are like, if he thinks we are criminals, then we'll be on the streets every single day. So that then he realizes it is the criminals in power we want out. But what happened on that day, Joe, is there was a certain group, I'm sure, to the best of my knowledge, there were not more than 50. But those were just guns who did things that were not part of the protest. But
Sure.
they never invested in identifying those. Instead, he just balkanized Kenyans and their very legitimate call for change, for a reset, for accountability as criminals. And he wasn't spared immediately. People, I don't know, I usually say, I think we recovered very fast. It was just like, what do you think you are? Who do you think you are? And immediately on social media, he was called out. And if you recall, on 26th, he came back and issued a second statement that was a bit more conciliatory. But we still hold that what he said the first time was his true sentiment and perception of what this was and how it ought to be dealt with. But that is the problem. When we are paying tax, we are not criminals. When we demand accountability for our tax, we become criminals. That's simply unacceptable. The social contract in Kenya is fundamentally broken. And even moving forward, he recently heard a town hall with university students, and you could see it was a town hall to convince them that, listen, my model is right, you're wrong. And he's being told of the lived experiences. What you're proposing doesn't work. Why are you introducing something when there's something that was working better? The matrices you're using are wrong. They are not practical. And you still want to imagine that your single view. And people right now in Kenya are fearless. They are fearless. They decided we are showing up. Oh, you called us to KICC. We'll come and tell you our truth. Members of Parliament have resumed Parliament, but say the budget and appropriations supplementary process. You would have expected after the mass protest that happened that they would heighten or increase the quality of public participation and listening. No, the timelines were shorter, less consideration, less opportunity for people to do written submissions. The vetting of the cabinet was a mockery of everything, yet people sent memoranda and affidavits in droves. All that was set aside. So increasingly, Kenyans are feeling we are not represented. I would say there's a lull, but the ultimate call for accountability and a government that truly works is still inbuilt and burning within the hearts, the bodies of the Kenyans. It takes a very little trigger right now in Kenya for people in any space to just get into their right mind and demand accountability. The beauty of it is we are at this moment where for once good is celebrated. I had lived in a Kenya where the corrupt, the wicked would just be glorified, they would get position. It almost even looked like we need to start raising our children to be schemers of bad things. So that's one of the good attributes that has come from the current process. And luckily, the Court of Appeal affirmed the Kenyan people by saying where public participation is not adequately conducted and government becomes sneaky, abuses their power during legislation, then that's unconstitutional, and the Finance Act was set
Because of
aside.
the constitutional requirement because of the constitutional requirement for public consultation.
Yeah.
What would your message be? I mean, we need to start looking at wrapping up our conversation, unfortunately, but what would your message be for members of parliament regarding what you would like them to improve? And I just want to preface that by saying that this is a tough conversation for me, from my perspective, because Kenya is still, when it comes to parliamentary oversight of public debt, they're still the leader, one of the leaders in Africa, one of the top 3 countries. And yet Parliament failed you, right? So, you've got the mechanisms there. You've got the review of the medium-term debt strategy. You've got a pre-budget statement. You have all kinds of things that other countries in Africa, we're only pointing to Kenya to say, look at what Kenya's doing. But yet you still feel that, when push comes to shove, Parliament failed you. What do you need change in Parliament? I think it's a character change you're looking for more than a mechanism change, unfortunately. But you tell me.
One, it's definitely a character change. It's also it's a culture change. Yes, character and culture change, because our parliament, it feels like they owe their allegiance to the political party leadership. So in most cases, it will be the President Ruto or the former Prime Minister Raila. So when you're opposing, this becomes Raila's position, not necessarily what the people require, what the people are saying. And I'm sure this time they were shaken by the amount of direct engagement that they received from the people. So that is what we require. It is a cultural change, both within parliament, political parties, and in the budget making process.
So Diana, I just want to share a couple of thoughts with you as we wrap up. The first one was one that I was thinking about this morning when I was getting ready for the day, and it's really been something that your story about being on the streets and being afraid of the violence really brought home for me, which is that I live in Canada. I live in a city called Moncton, New Brunswick, in the province of New Brunswick. It's relatively safe, stable, quiet, sometimes boring. And I thought about today the fact that I know that you're on the front lines, and many of your colleagues and friends are on the front lines of a huge protest to really keep Kenya as a democracy, and to make sure that the voice of the people is heard. And so I just want to pass on to you my profound respect, because it's easy for me to have this conversation from my safe perch here in Moncton, New Brunswick, but I realize that you and your colleagues have actually been putting your life on the line to bring about this change. And so I just really want to pass that on, my respect to you and your colleagues and friends for the incredible work that you're doing to keep this fight alive.
Thank you very much. Much appreciated. That affirmation keeps us going, even when it feels very scary and risky, sometimes thankless. Thank you very much.
Thank you again, Diana Gichengo, the Executive Director of the Institute for Social Accountability and the coordinator of the Uchumi Debt Coalition. Wonderful to have you on the podcast, and look forward to talking to you again.
Human Coined is an integral part of Nexus PFM Consulting. If you enjoyed this episode, you can also find us on YouTube and on your favorite podcast app. If you have any questions about the work we do, you can contact us at info@nexuspfm.com.